It's my great pleasure and privilege to welcome Professor and Dean Julen MacNeil today to our Conversations with Legal Thinkers series. For those who are watching us out there, could you say a few words as a way of introduction?
Well, thank you, Julen, and good day, everybody, from down under. It's Bill MacNeil streaming from beautiful Byron Bay and the iconic Northern Rivers, the north coast of New South Wales, where I am the Dean of the School of Law and Justice at Southern Cross University and occupy the Honourable John Dowd Chair in Law, and as well as a professorship in jurisprudence. Previously, I was a Dean of Law at Griffith Law School in Brisbane, and before that taught at the University of Hong Kong in the Faculty of Law and in the Department of Law at the London School of Economics and Political Science. But originally, I am Canadian, Atlantic Canadian, a blue noser, son of Nova Scotia and Cape Breton. You can take the boy out of the Maritimes, but you can't take the Maritimes out of the boy. So still proudly Canadian after 40 years of travels. Graduate of the Dalhousie Law School, class of '84, University College London, and Columbia. That's where I did my legal education, but I also have another discipline, which is literature, which I studied at the University of Toronto and briefly at Johns Hopkins University.
I wanted to address your role as a jurisprud, as a legal theorist. How would you define the field of jurisprudence or of legal theory, and how would you also characterize your own approach to it?
Well, I think jurisprudence is a kind of catch-all, but I think at its fundament, jurisprudence engages the idea of law. You know, that is core for me. There can be practices of law that it captures as well, various applications or whatever, but fundamentally, there's a core question at the heart of jurisprudence, which is simply, what do we mean by law when we say law? And how is that different from force or power or politics or nature? And how do we define that law? Is it God's law? Is it the sovereign's command? Is it some sort of judicial or bureaucratic rule? Or is it something else altogether, a creature of the economy, a tool of the ruling class, an element of desire? You know, so, but nonetheless, that for me, the core of jurisprudence is constantly interrogating and raising this question of, what do we mean by law when we say law? What is the idea of law that animates us? Now, you asked for my perspective: critical, contextual, theoretical, but above all, interdisciplinary. So I'm one of those scholars that feels that law, jurisprudence, the idea of law, is too valuable just to be left to the technically trained lawyers. Too significant just to languish in the law school seminar room or the law school library. Not that there are interesting definitions and formulae that come out of there, but it ignores the tremendous purchase that law has on the imagination of other fields. For me, the fields that have been most simpatico have been literature, film, television, art, popular fictions, all of which I think have something very valuable to say about law and its ideas, whether it's the idea of justice, the idea of human rights, the idea of the connection between law and morality. I think you can find very interesting, not just representations, you know, legal process of lawyers, etc. That, you know, popular culture abounds in those. But I'm going even further, representations of ideas, and also a rethinking of those ideas, a reimagination of those ideas as well.
You are yourself the dean of the law school. You were the dean of Griffith Law School as well, you do have an institutional position within law school. This being said, what do you think might be the value for students in taking jurisprudence within the law school?
Jurisprudence in law schools, absolutely central. And in a sense, the problem with law schools is that there's almost too much jurisprudence. Or let me qualify that. Too much jurisprudence of a particular school. So the curriculum is still largely dominated, no matter how much we tweak it and fine tune it and try and bring it up to date, it's largely dominated by positivist assumptions, about where law is sourced, the sovereign's command, or whether that's extended to the judges, to the bureaucracy, etc. And there's a kind of formalism in instruction, that's about the letter of the law, and the spirit gets lost. So I would say we need to work a little bit harder on pluralizing, the law school in terms of theoretical orientations. And I know that people are making powerful moves to do that, but there's a kind of professional inertia as well, that militates against transformation. I know in Australia, we have what's known as the priestly 11 that must be taught, a sort of a set of core units. I'm fine with that. I actually think a canon is a good thing to have, which is why I would always opt for calling this field jurisprudence rather than the philosophy of law or legal theory. You can hook on to tradition, but you can take it elsewhere. The problem with the priestly 11, though, is that they've mandated, what has to be covered in these subjects. And what has to be covered, the assumptions there, are purely positivist, certain cases, certain pieces of legislation, rather than, let's say, trying to reimagine contract through the social contractarians or Grant Gilmore or whatever, So I would say that jurisprudence is playing a central role in law schools and always has. The problem here, though, is one or two schools have hijacked the agenda. Maybe one or two others have smuggled themselves into law and economics or a certain kind of watered down sociological jurisprudence, have had some impact. But real critique, that transforms the curriculum, this law school, the way we think, is still missing. And I think, that's a tremendous loss. Universities started with jurisprudence. It was canon law, that really started being taught at places like Bologna and Salamanca and the great universities of Europe. We could recover some of that and take it elsewhere. Really embrace critique seriously.
I wanted to ask a little bit of your very prolific international career. I want to ask you about how has this international experience changed your perspective or enrich your perspective on law?
Well, I suppose the encounters with different cultures have really, diversified my understanding of the idea of law. So Hong Kong, for example, there I actually lived, in a colonial situation. It wasn't a metaphor. It was a crown colony at that time in the 1980s, 1990s. And there weren't just vestiges of colonialism. It was a fully functioning operative colonial state. And that brought you into contact with customary law as well. So the Chinese pre-revolutionary law that had been preserved by the British, a tremendous preservative. So the society was always already comparative there. And that led me into understandings of law that took me through, I suppose, the deep structures of Chinese thought, Confucian, Taoist, legalist, the various takes that China, this great alternative to the West has in its notion of recht. You know, Australia, my time here has really sensitized me to the First Peoples, who might be, I think, accurately characterized as possessing the world's oldest continuous jurisprudential system. You know, they keep pushing the year back of when they find remains or traces. Currently it's 60,000 years ago. I'm sure it'll go to 100,000 years ago. You know, and key to that tradition is this notion of law, which comes from the land. You know, and the land is the source of the law, and the law suffuses the land, you know, in this sense of obligation and custodianship that the Aboriginal peoples feel towards the land that we call Australia. You know. So that's a very rich tradition that's being recuperated as I speak, you know, and that was what really, I think, Australia has added to my understanding of the law. I suppose with America, the culture of rights, you know, and the debates around the Constitution, you know, which Canada replicated just as I was leaving the country in the early 80s as the Charter was being adopted in Canada. Up until then, rights were at common law and largely notional. You know, whereas the Americans, you know, had these tremendous cases, you know, Brown and the Board of Education, or, you know, these trailblazing, you know, Roe and Wade, you know, where ethics, politics, sexuality, race were being debated in the courts. And it was because there was this language of rights, for better or worse, embedded at the center of their constitution. And Britain, I suppose my time there really introduced me to, or solidified, my understanding of the Westminster system, but also, and this is where it value added in a way that Canada didn't, which had at that time more of a consensus culture, and trying to make the system work and broker deals between the English and the French and the First Nations and but what I liked about my time in the UK was the politicization of, and that went to the polarization of that society in the 1980s. And there was the era of Mrs. Thatcher, whose ideology was absolutely transparent. There was no more ideological obfuscation. She was absolutely about what she said she absolutely meant, you know. And that actually makes you take sort of positions, you know, and that's where I suppose critique confronted me in a very real way for the first time.
In that note, I want to bring a conversation to the idea of engagement with popular culture, and you've been very much interested, and you've been written on such icons as Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Lord of the Rings, and lately you've been even writing about Game of Thrones. So my question is what draws you to that popular culture, what draws you to it, but also what is that you draw from it, jurisprudentially and in terms of your thinking about law?
It really started with teaching. So it was actually teaching jurisprudence in a law school is hard work. It's hard for two reasons. First, it's a demanding subject with this arcane vocabulary. It draws on a lot of philosophy, and it picks up the argot of economics, of politics, of psychology, of a range of fields, you know, and the actual readings are tough. You know, the Kelsons and the Austins and the Dworkins and the Harts and the McKinnons And the Williams, they take no prisoners. They're really, they're high level thinkers, and are dealing with tricky concepts. So it's demanding. It takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of energy on the part of the student and the teacher. Also, as far as a lot of students are concerned, there's no practical payoff. Unlike, let's say, like tax law. I'm going to use this in practice. Very rarely do you hear someone say, I'm going to use my Kelsen in practice. Or there's a Dworkin problem that'll come up, I'm sure, but the notion of principle, while I'm in practice, it will actually, in all sorts of subtle and not so subtle ways, people will be wrestling with those problems, but that's the perception anyway. So jurisprudence is a tough gig. In sheer desperation, I started turning to popular culture because I kept on referencing it. When people would say, I'm not understanding this idea of the Grundnorm. And in just sheer frustration, I would say, the Grundnorm, it's this little bit of the real that will complete legitimacy, will give you complete power. It'll make the system work. It's like that ring in Tolkien's saga that everyone is searching for complete mastery and power. Sauron himself needs it to take corporeal form. Everyone else wants it because it'll make Gondor the superpower, or Sam Ganji, the new, the second coming of Christ, or, but it has an analogous function. All of these illustrations, all of a sudden, were meant to explain. But I also found that these texts started saying things to me about the law. That I thought it wasn't just coincidence, that I was grabbing this out of the air, that they were actually not just illustrating and representing, but critiquing and reimagining. And I started to write these things out, and that became my first book, Lex Populi, The Jurisprudence of Popular Culture. And by the way, when I was listed in the Encyclopedia of Buffy Studies as lawyer, jurisprude, Buffy expert, I felt my work is done. That was a proud moment.
I want to go perhaps a different language, a different explanatory language for you, which has been psychoanalysis. And so I wanted to ask about why psychoanalysis and how psychoanalysis, what does it help you to understand about the law, and how do you approach it?
Well, Freud with Marx, have been the two shaping influences. One that goes to the material, the economic, political, the economic base, I suppose, and then all the various superstructures. But Freud and the psychoanalytic tradition go to the subject. And that's what I like about psychoanalysis. It puts the subject front row and center. And not just the subject of reason or rationality, which, reason, lawyers are certainly familiar with the reasonable man. And economists are always familiar with the rational agent of utility, and other fields have that. But psychoanalysis gives us a far more complicated, and I think in some respect, a far more accurate understanding of the subject as split, as ambivalent, indeterminate, and that's, I think, the conscious and the unconscious. So there's this level of reason, and we're all familiar with reasonable arguments, and we're trained in that too. We have that rhetoric, but underneath there is a desire that's animating that and driving it, in all sorts of unusual and complicated ways. And that has really been, I think, for me, absolutely critical in trying to unpack the law of the desire and the desire for law. And it's happening all around us. So it's not just something that I'm imposing, a prism that I'm seeing the world through. It's actually, so flagrant. I can't ignore it. For example, just a couple of years ago, there was a piece of legislation in Queensland called, and this was part of a moral panic that was going on around bikie gangs on the Gold Coast, which is a holiday area in Queensland that attracts a certain kind of holidaymaker that gets up to some shenanigans. And the bikie gangs were involved in the drug trade and in prostitution and in the nightclubs, the senior side of the nightclub culture. And the government of the day, because of other things that were going on, they decided to turn this into an issue and, enacted a piece of legislation called the Vicious Lawless Associate Disestablishmentarian Act. Vlad, like Vlad the Impaler, from history, but it was Vlad. This is a true story. And it's only 2013, 2014 that this was going on, and it absolutely fetishized but phobicized, the bikie figure, and it mentions, it prohibits the wearing of particular rings, but also T-shirts, insignia, and went even so far as like leather jackets. So almost everyone became susceptible to being under arrest in Queensland. People who wore things like a T-shirt with Sons of Anarchy, the TV show, that HBO show series, or a leather jacket, or a ring that had a 1% logo on it, which was en vogue with certain high school students or whatever. So in a way, the landscape, had these sort of phobic areas that were beginning to emerge. And underneath it was this understanding that bikies were enjoying too much, and may even been stealing the enjoyment of others, particularly the government, And anyway, in any event, it all came a cropper, and the government became the phobic object. The legislation was so extreme that the voters turned against it. But to me, I think it absolutely, crystallized, a certain psychic economy that's underlying legislation, as much as a political economy.
Talking about books, I have your novel judgments here with me. I want to ask you about some feminist critique or feminist underlying feminism that I sense in the book, in the figures such as Jane Austen, that you pit against the jurisprudence of John Austen, and Mary Wollstonecraft, Mary Shelley as well. What can you tell us about this underlying feminist project in your book?
Right. Well, I mean, I wrote my dissertation for my JSD at Columbia University. And I had, at that time, I was, I guess, a critical legal scholar operating in a more recognizable vein. This would have been the early 90s. But I had the very good fortune to have as a supervisor a leading American feminist and race theorist, well, two leading race theorists, one a queer scholar, one a feminist scholar, Patricia Williams and Kendall Thomas. It was Pat's work in The Alchemy of Race and Rights that had such a profound influence on me. I think it's a wonderful book. It's like a prose poem, And really, I think what that actually put the brakes on my critical tendency to dismiss rights out of hand as just a tool of the ruling class or patriarchy or colonialism. And to take rights seriously in a way that was non-Dworkinian, but also, I suppose, satirically, because it's me as well. And to find another, genealogy for rights. And this is the Shelley Wollstonecraft piece, The Monstrous Body of the Law, which very briefly, is trying to locate rights in an alternative romanticism. So not just the grand tradition of Rousseau and his predecessors, the social contractarians, and then the various rights instruments of the Declaration of the Rights of Man, or the Bill of Rights of the American Constitution, or of the 1689 settlement in the UK. But to actually say, that there's a feminist version of rights that's present at the originary scene. So there's a critique of rights, that's there, just as, Talleyrand and all of them are announcing rights. There's Mary Wollstonecraft writing, all well and good, chaps, but is there a woman in this text? And where are they? And if you read Vindication of the Rights of Women, she describes women without rights as monsters. I don't think it's a coincidence that her daughter, Mary Shelley, Shelley writes one of the great books about monstrosity, a generation later. Now, they never knew each other because one died in childbirth, giving birth to the other. But certainly Mary Shelley read her mother's work obsessively. And I think the lesson that she was taking was if women without rights, are monsters, then having rights potentially creates monstrosity. And she gives us the story of a monster that turns on its creator, much like rights discourse, turned on its creators. We thought we were creating these rights, that we owned, possessed, or whatever. They end up possessing us. So the rights of emancipation turned out to be rights of ownership, of property, of contract. This is where, feminism is my model for theory, because it's plural, it's diverse, it's profoundly theoretical, but also profoundly embodied, and experiential.
We're coming almost to the end of our conversation, but I wanted to ask you about the project you are currently embarked in, which, as I understand it, is part of a trilogy, is the third part of your trilogy on speculative jurisprudence. And my question was in the real world in which we live, and by this I mean the world of mass media and also reality TV personalities. Why do you write a speculative jurisprudence, and why do you think it's important that you reclaim the role of the speculation?
Well, if we don't, the role of computation will move center stage, and while the computer may compute, it doesn't think, or technology, really. I'm not bashing computers. I'm just saying the technocratic attitude, will take over, which could see, the law become an adjunct to the computational, the algorithmic, and squeeze interpretation, analysis, imagination out of the law altogether. And I think this is why the current spate of speculative fictions, whether it's The Walking Dead, Game of Thrones, The Hunger Games, are so powerful, because they move front row and center the absolutely key role of the speculative. How do we rethink our relationship with nature, That might be one of the key themes of Game of Thrones. How do we rethink our relationship with others, governance, etc., in the wake of, catastrophe, which might be the story of The Walking Dead. How do we rethink distribution? Distributive justice, the Hunger Games. Yeah. So I think these are what these fictions are giving me, access to reimagining these key questions. And I think this is why they are so popular, why they resonate with so many people, young people, older people, all of us. So it's a genuinely, I suppose, lex populi, people, law by and for the people.
Which is in my drawer as well.
Thank you so much.
So I've really enjoyed our conversation, Bill, and I just want to thank you for talking to us and for talking to my class. And I'm just looking forward to continuing our conversation in the future as well.
Well, really looking forward to getting together again in better times when this scourge has lifted and we can actually resume face-to-face, either in Vancouver, in Byron Bay, or elsewhere, or all of the above.